The resolution before the House today is that this House wouldn't upload to the federal government all, that's the long version of the motion, all public transit infrastructure and operations.
She
To the
ended it
federal
after I
government.
sent it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I shortened it.
It's
so that
whatever
it's
you guys
easier.
got.
But yeah, so upload all public transit infrastructure and operations to the federal government. Yes.
Ashley's gonna do our rebuttal, even though she's note taker. I hope you guys are okay with that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, we can skip the formalities and I call upon the Prime Minister to deliver, the speech for no more than 7 minutes, no grace time. It is 7, do you wanna do 5?
No, I don't care.
Okay. What would you guys like to do?
I was a little zoned out. What was that?
Oh, well, I think it's 7 minutes in the rule book, but if you want.
Should we
to
double
do
check the
five,
rule book real quick?
Yeah.
No,
I don't
Let's
care,
double
we
check
can
the
go
rule.
on.
I thought,
five and then
this
two.
is,
Did they
I thought
change it
this
this
speech
year?
was 7 minutes.
That's
Yeah.
what we
Okay,
were.
then
That's
I'm
what I
just
was
definitely
assuming,
wrong.
because they changed it from last year. Last year
They
was
just
5
changed
minutes.
the length of no, last year was 7, but they changed the length of the,
It's 7.
Let's just check the handbook real quick.
Hey, Khalil, can you pass me that Red Bull, please?
The what?
The Red Bull?
By the fruit.
Fruit? Or, you know, bring Sam a piece of fruit too.
Oh, no, wait, Josh, that's a little
No matter
rubbish.
what.
Fuck the effort I just put in.
I already committed, once I got up, I was enough.
I'll get better man, come on, man.
Absolutely.
Let's go with 7 minutes and we'll see what she says.
Okay, are we,
You can search in the
Yeah, it'll
WhatsApp
take 30 seconds to find out.
is my
yeah,
time?
And
it's
go under
loading
links.
PDF at this moment.
Shouldn't we know this by this point, guys?
We definitely should.
Well, I'm pretty
And that is
sure
why the
it's-
motion was
It's definitely
static.
7 and I just fucked on.
Yeah, do you guys just wanna do 7?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Alright, whenever
Also,
you're ready.
shh. Okay. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. We have come to the House to gather today to debate the motion that this House would upload all public transit infrastructure operation to the federal government. On-site government, we are defining this to public transit to be all buses, subways, ferries, trains, etc. And the government will fully have control over operation and infrastructure of these systems. We have developed a model. The municipalities and provinces will be selling 51% stake in all public transit, giving 100% power in the infrastructure and operations to the federal government, and will be implementing a revenue sharing system with the municipalities and the provincial interests. Here on site government, we are here to move people socially, economically, and literally, and we see this, our case as a split between the social and the economic benefits. I will be discussing national unity, while my colleagues George and Sam will both be respectively talking about the efficient distribution of labor, climate change, and then Sam will begin to talk about equity. So I would first like to begin at my point of national unity. We need a Canada that is not divided. We need a Canada that everyone feels like we belong. Why is this important? We see today in today's status quo that we have a Canada in which Albertans feel left out. After the previous election, we have seen that a rise in the bloc seats, meaning that Quebec separatism is on the rise. And we need these people to feel included in our nation, because a divided Canada is a weaker Canada. And we on-site government feel that a nationalized transit system would bring these people together. A divided Canada makes people feel as though they are belonging not only to our country, but they belong to the cities which they live in, or the provinces we live in, which develops this interfighting that we currently have in our nation that bogs our progress down, that brings our economy down, but you would disagree.
If national unity is fundamentally linked to what the federal government does, why do we have provincial governments at all? Would you abolish them?
This is not about the main responsibilities of provincial and federal governments. This is about accessibility to the rest of Canada, and we on-site government believe that if Canadians are better able to access the rest of Canada and see other parts of Canada that they would not normally be able to easily, they would feel more Canadian rather than Albertan, rather than Saskatchewanian, rather than Torontonian. We see these divisions as weakening Canada, but you would disagree.
Why do you need to move everything to the federal level to make that happen? Explain directly, please.
I will actually. Under the current status quo, we currently see our Aboriginal reserves up north, where provinces has failed to adequately connect them with the rest of Canada. Within Manitoba, side opposition is unaware that the train tracks were washed away, and Churchill was inaccessible for quite some time, no thank you, but the provincial government was unable to step in and provide adequate funds to fix this in a timely manner for the people of Churchill. Imagine a world in which you're stuck in your small town because you do not have the funds to get to a large city, to make your appointments, to see a show, and that makes you resent out everywhere else outside and commit to your rural town. No, thank you. And again, a divided Canada is a weaker Canada. Indigenous communities right now do not have access to larger cities, and some of them are stuck and don't have adequate access to education, to health services, and with this national system, they were better able to get to these places. No, thank you. And with this, rather than feeling as though their community is alone in this and that they see no benefit to living within their province, where cities are given bigger projects, where cities have all these leisurely things that they cannot get to, that they will feel more a part in the fold. And again, we've seen this time and time again in Canadian history with the rise of the Bloc Party in seats, with talks of separatism in the West, and we see this as weakening Canada, as we are not talking about how to strengthen our nation, we are talking about how to keep our nation together, and that is not going to be growth. And it is within our charters and rights of freedom that Canadians have a freedom of mobility, and we need to enable this as a federal government, because it's the federal government that mandated this Charter of Rights and Freedom, and we need to provide this for our citizens. We need to provide this freedom of mobility, because currently without this, we see a divided Canada, and this is not the best Canada we need to see, because we here on side government believe that we need to move people socially, we need to move people economically, and we need to literally move people in order to strengthen our nation. No, thank you. So what have we talked about today? We've discussed a model in which we will have a 51% stake, the federal government being we, in all public transit, giving 100% power to infrastructure and operations to the federal government. We'll implement a revenue sharing system that includes municipalities and provincial government interests. And we have seen that this is a simple argument for side government that includes social and economical benefits. We've seen in my speech today that a divided Canada is a weaker Canada because of examples in the current status quo, where we've seen movements of separatism from other provinces because they do not specifically feel Canadian, they feel loyal to their provinces and they feel loyal to their towns, as well as we needed the Indigenous communities to feel more a part of Canada, more as if we are doing things in order to provide a better quality of life. And we are seeing that as a federal government, we need to provide what we promise to our citizens, and that is important to this case, as we promise to have a freedom of mobility for all citizens, and we believe on side government that nationalizing our public transit systems will better be able to serve the public, giving them freedom of mobility, and that is why this motion should stand. Thank you.
I thank the member for their speech, and I now call upon the Leader of the Opposition. And also, just to clarify, the rule book does say 777 for everyone's speeches, and then 4 for the reply speeches.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. Totally all good.
It's bad that we didn't just know that it's.
Yeah, all of us were like, honestly, I didn't
At least we're all on the same page in that
Yeah.
regard, so that's good.
And yeah, start whenever you're ready.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, I just want to start out by saying that I've yet to hear of a public transit project or a public transit system that serves as a point of national pride, that unifies people of different ethnicities, cultures, or different geographical regions. But that's beside the point. I'm here to talk about why I'm proud to represent the opposition. First, let me reiterate and discuss a little bit the role of the federal government. especially in relation to the provincial governments and the other municipal governments that we have established under our law. I take, for example, European nations, which are also federations, such as Germany, which is an example that my colleagues and I discussed. Canada and Germany, though both being federations, are two fundamentally different countries with two different cultures and two different legal systems. Big reason for this is geography. Canada is the second largest country in the world by land area. It is. Just like the United States, our system of government and our laws reflect our geography from our very founding as a country. And as a result, we have what are known as provincial governments. And these provincial governments are responsible for a wide variety of issues that the federal government is unable to provide. Or I shouldn't say maybe unable to provide, but would be inadequate for regional interests. So I bring it up again. If the provincial governments do not, not now, if the provincial governments are unable to meet the interests of their own citizens and represent their own citizens at the federal level, what is the federal government going to do for them? Canada has a very small population relative to its size. And like I said, it's geographically the second largest country in the world, and this vast exposure necessitates a federal government. This ensures that the needs of all constituents are met, and as a result, the federal government has a small number of responsibilities that it should be focused on. These responsibilities are more aggregate needs that serve the needs and the purposes of all Canadians. And I want to reference national defense, the federal budget. These are issues that need a wide consensus from a wide variety of constituents and people who represent a wide variety of viewpoints. That's why they work at the federal level. And I'm here to argue, and my colleagues are here to argue, that the federal government would not be effective at all in federalizing our public transit system. The Prime Minister mentioned that this would somehow magically unify the country, that we have this notion of Western separatism, that we have the Bloc Québécois coming to power and they want their own country as well, and Quebec wants to separate from Canada. So I want to talk about the fact again that how would a federalized public transit network fix those problems? How would that solve unity at all? How would that unite the East with the West? If anything, would that not centralize even more power in the federal government in Ottawa? Would that not give more power to individuals who do not represent the interests of Quebec or the West? Furthermore, this issue of Indigenous rights came into play, which I would like to reiterate that I do see this as a problem, but once again, the issue here is a lack of funding. Now, I understand that provinces have neglected these communities from time to time, but I, again, want to reiterate the fact that the federal government, especially when it comes to public transit, will not make this issue any better. Yes, sir.
Honourable Speaker, does the current member not realize that, as he said, Canada is a large geographic nation with a small population? And does he also not realize that the federal government has a larger budget than the provinces? I fail to see how the current member could possibly be missing the obvious link that the federal government, given the large geographic size of Canada, is better suited to this issue as perhaps like the military is.
Like I said again, and if my colleague here would have listened a tad closer, he would pick this up. But the military and national defense serves the aggregate good. It serves the needs of all people. I totally agree with you. There are municipalities and governments or provinces which do not have the sufficient funds that are necessary. We're going to be discussing that further momentarily. However, that does not mean that they can't make the correct decisions given access to those funds. There's something called transfer payments, which the federal government already engages in. For less wealthy provinces or those with a smaller tax base, there are payments that are given to them in order for them to develop their infrastructure and in order for them to invest in their own people. However, fundamentally, the decisions are still made by the municipal governments, they're still made by the provincial governments to a large extent. So once again, why do we need to give the federal government yet another mandate to essentially form more laws and have even a greater jurisdiction than they already do? Myself and the opposition believe that this should be left to the municipal governments, to the provinces. By no means is this the perfect system, but simply giving the federal government greater control over an aspect such as public transit is certainly not the solution. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the member for his speech, and I now call upon the second member of side government, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Today, Psy government is proposing to you to upload public transportation to the federal government level. We see this as necessary to move people socially, economically, and literally throughout our nation. So I'd like to start by refuting a couple points made by Team Op, and then I will go into some rebuilds of the points made by Khalil before moving on to the economic benefits, specifically the efficient distribution of labor, and how this is the most economically efficient way for us to fight climate change. So first off, a point made by the leader of the opposition at the beginning of his speech was, he's never heard of public transit that unites the country. Well, Honorable Speaker, one of the very first things the founders of this country did was build the Canadian National Railway to unite East and West. Because when you are separated, when you have no way of getting between places, you are divided. When you have easy access and are able to move yourself and your family from place to place within a region, you build links, you build bridges, you build and strengthen that bond with people in other provinces. So we see that point is falling. He secondly made this idea that, Canada is geographically large. And then the idea that, the federal government couldn't do this because if the provincial and municipal governments can't take care of the local needs of people, how could the federal? Well, Honorable Speaker, the issue that we see with that is that urban areas often lie over multiple jurisdictions of provinces and of municipalities. Honorable Speaker, in Canada, between Windsor and Quebec City, there is a city almost every 10 kilometers. It is an extremely dense place with people commuting across provincial and municipal boundaries each and every day. Honorable Speaker, under status quo, where the control of transportation is in the hands of the provinces, those provinces are only building for the people within them. When Quebec is building its infrastructure around Montreal, it's taking no account into people in Ontario and how they will use it, how people from Toronto can get to Montreal and build and strengthen. Honorable Speaker, this is exactly why we need to do this, because our country has expanded beyond this, where our urban areas are crossing multiple jurisdictions. It's no longer feasible for just one jurisdiction to run this in many areas of our country. So we see that point as fallen. I now like to move into my constructive. So I'm going to talk to you about why this is so necessary for the federal government in order to economically strengthen our country. When we think about transportation over large areas and we move beyond just thinking about how we can serve our municipality, we build a network of transportation that allows people to move freely and efficiently throughout the whole of this country, not just their own backyard. Honorable Speaker, many people could find work in other provinces or cities, but they are trapped on where they are right now because our current system of transportation only caters to keeping people within those urban areas. But what we see was if we expand this to the federal level, we are giving them access to a wider range of economic opportunities. But you would disagree.
Mr. Speaker, why can't the federal government just put forward some plan to unite the borders? Why do they have to take charge of the individual level within the cities? Why do they need all the decision power for that part of it?
Thank you very much. Honorable Speaker, you can't build a network with one part building by one government, the other building by the other government. We need to take a holistic approach where we are integrating every municipality together, every province together. We are uniting Canada through this efficiently and in order, because when provinces or municipalities, no thank you, have the power, they only have their interests in mind. They do not have the interests of our country. If I'm in Quebec City and my country or my municipality is controlled by Quebec nationalists, they have no interest in building a network that will strengthen all of Canada. They only want to serve themselves. No, thank you. So when we expand this network, we allow people to move around more efficiently. So right now in Canada, it is a geographically vast place. And it is hard to get around. It is expensive to get a plane ticket from one city to another in Canada. If we upload this responsibility of public transportation infrastructure to the federal government, we can start building systems that integrate and interlock each and every municipality to build a network that will allow people to get around. Also, only the federal government has this level of budget. Only the federal government can raise sufficient monies to do this. No, thank you. We have seen under status quo, provinces and municipalities have failed again and again and again to fund adequate levels of public transportation. No, thank you. I'd now like to move in how Canada has made a commitment to fight climate change, and this is the most efficient way to do that. Honorable Speaker, Quebec City did not sign the Paris Accords. Winnipeg did not sign the Paris Accords. The Canadian government signed the Paris Accords. It is the Canadian government that made a commitment to fighting climate change. And what we see on our side of the House is that giving people access to public transportation is one of the most efficient ways of displacing the use of cars and the emissions associated with that. When we upload this to the federal government and we give the resource capacity, the ability to plan over multiple municipalities and provinces, we are creating a more efficient system that will allow us to stop more people from using their cars and further reduce emissions at a lower and more efficient cost. So, what have we seen today? Our side has talked about how this is going to integrate Canada nationally and how it's going to strengthen our economy. I have talked about how when there's efficient transportation, people are able to move around. They're able to find jobs that they would not normally be able to find, and that can extend beyond the municipality in which they currently reside under our model. I've also talked about Canada's commitment to climate change and why this is so important for it. For those reasons, this motion must stand. Thank you.
I thank the member for your speech, and I now call upon the second member of the government. Or opposition, sorry. No? Yeah. Anyways, whenever you're ready.
Ladies and gentlemen, the issue in this debate is not the connectedness of the country from coast to coast. I'd ask you, how often do you personally travel from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast? Like maybe once a year. And even if you wanted to do that, there are increasingly cheap, good options for you to do that. You don't need to federalize this system, and for that reason, because the government is making an incredibly unnecessary step that infringes provincial rights, we are very proud to oppose. All right, so quickly before I get into refutation, I would like to make something very clear. Fundamentally, we just don't think this is necessary. But this is not us denying the problem of public transportation. We think that it is a very important problem, and we think that in many provinces, the transit system is indeed in peril. But we need to ask ourselves why. It's not because there's a lack of oversight on the operations that suddenly the federal government can fix. It's primarily because of lack of funding. And we think that we can achieve improvement in these areas with things like transfer payments. We don't see why the government suddenly has to take over operations of Winnipeg Public Transit. It makes no sense to us on our side of the House, and we would like a response. All right, sure.
The reason that the federal government needs to take over, Honorable Speaker, is because the federal government is able to provide a unified oversight. The purpose of public
No, I
transportation...
understand. I don't think there's a unified oversight because the entire country is incredibly different in its needs. Think about the terrain. Think about just how people get to work in Vancouver versus somewhere in Manitoba. We think that if the federal government were to go and take over all this, they would need to do incredible research into these things, which would further delay the process and make things incredibly inefficient. No thank you. So let me quickly go into some refutation before extending our case. First, they talked about how there's certain cases where municipal boundaries do cross. They gave the example of Ontario and Quebec. Our side would say Ontario and Quebec, if that's important to them, should certainly work together to increase the connectedness of their system. But we don't think that the federal government should take over all of transit all across the country. Why should someone in Yukon, for example, who didn't want this at all, pay for this because Ontario and Quebec couldn't figure things out between themselves on their own? We think that's frankly ridiculous. Okay. They also talked about the economic benefits of this, how people can suddenly move across the country, get jobs, visit family. Like, are they living in the 1930s? This already happens today. We have increasingly cheaper options. No, thank you. We show you Flair Air. We show you the incredible ease of taking a bus across provincial boundaries. We don't think that this is really a boundary, and if anything, we think they've over-exaggerated the benefits that we get on their side of the house. Also, we don't see why we need to, regulate inner city control to achieve what they want. Like, why does Winnipeg public transit suddenly need to be taken care of by the federal government? When Winnipeg public transit only operates in the city of Winnipeg, it's not even dealing with any of the benefits they'd like to get. Okay, and then they had this kind of strange point about climate change. They told us that Canada has committed to the Paris Accords and the entire country should really commit themselves to it. We'd say that, one, voters in many provinces think this is important. We think that municipal leaders already try to focus on this. And if they want to improve it, we think that transfer payments are a very good way to do this because we want to maintain that provincial efficiency, but also that autonomy of the provinces. Sure.
Is the side opposition not aware that actually the Manitoban premiers and the Albertan premiers have openly discussed their disdain for this agreement and how they will try to stay away from these changes?
I'd say that even if that were true, I'd say that provincial governments need to have certain power over their own constituents. We'd say that when constituents want change, those constituents will vote for change. If jobs and oil sands are more important to them, then it's completely in their right to vote that way. But we're getting completely away from the debate, which is about public transport. We think that what's really important here is to focus on why the federal government should or should not take care of these matters. All right, so I have one point to discuss with you today, which is disenfranchisement of smaller electorates. This is a really interesting clash with their national unity point. They told us that if we have this public transport or federal transport system, we're going to have national unity where everyone gets along better, everyone's more proud to be Canadian. My partner Jacob already showed you how we just don't see how those impacts actually mechanize. But furthermore, we tell you that this is actually going to lower national unity because of the disenfranchisement it will cause in Parliament. We tell you that when anything is federalized, it becomes a tool for politicians to campaign on, often to the disadvantage of smaller, less powerful provinces in terms of the power they hold to elect the next government. So what do I mean by this? Well, we all know that the Yukon, for example, has a much fewer ridings, fewer seats than Ontario. But what does that mean for a place like the Yukon or even Saskatchewan? It means that the federal government will be less likely to focus on their public transport system, which they need just as much as someone in the GTA. But however, when we contrast this to a provincial government, we'd say that the mandate of a provincial government is fundamentally to look after the concerns of those provincial constituents. We don't think that a federal government can do this as well. Why is this the case? We provide you analysis on cost. We think that it's better for the federal government to focus their funds, which are limited, on areas which will be more fruitful for them in the next election cycle. So that really impacts what gets done. But it also impacts what even gets researched and thought about. Why would anyone spend time looking at how to improve transportation in Saskatchewan when they know that they're going to appease the most voters by making sure Toronto is really efficient? We don't stand for that on our side of the house. So quickly, why is provincial management better? Once again, it's the mandate of the provincial government. It concerns the people in that province. And fundamentally, relative size doesn't matter. In fact, that's the very reason we have provincial government in the first place. The reason we don't have federalized, like completely federalized education is because we want provinces to be able to listen to their constituents and not have that power be overridden by someone in the federal government who cares about getting reelected. And it's divisive because it's divisive in all these ways. Because we don't get national unity. And because their side hasn't achieved any progress on things like climate change or provincial rights or dealt with any of the real problems that we've presented, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I think the member finished speech, and I now call upon the third government member to deliver a speech for no more than 7 minutes. Whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. We've got a little bit of a mess here, so I'm going to try to untangle this as much as I possibly can. But first, there are just a couple of specific words, phrases, and points that were made that I want to address directly. So the previous member, in her sort of thematic opening, told us what the issue is not. But unfortunately, we didn't actually hear from side opposition at all what the issue is. The question was raised, how often do you travel east to west? And on side government, we would say, like, that's a very good question. How often do you travel east to west? Might you travel east to west more if we had better transit systems? These are important questions for Canada. These are things that we actually need to know and understand, and we can't just say, because the status quo is that people don't, doesn't mean that if things change, the status quo won't change as well. That is like what change means. That's the definition of change. I tried to raise this in a POI, and the point was countered essentially with the idea of, well, think about the terrain, right? Like every place is different, and so you're gonna have to learn about the terrain of every different place. And like, yeah, that's true. The prairies are different than the Canadian Shield, but every city has buses. Like, pardon me, I didn't realize that BC has amphibious buses that drive to Vancouver Island. Like, this is not actually a valid point. Transit is relatively uniform. Like, there are specific niche things, but they are not so vast that you cannot have a unified transit plan. Transit is very simple. The idea is we want to move people both socially, economically, and literally. You would disagree.
Sir, just because you can, even if you could, doesn't mean you should. Tell us how this won't disenfranchise people in their provinces.
So, okay, let's talk about that. I was going to get to that quite a bit later, but we'll just jump right down to it. How does this not disenfranchise people in the provinces? So from side opposition, what we're actually seeing here is a sleight of hand shifting the burden, because what actually happens currently with public transit is within provinces and within municipalities, that still actually happens. There are people in cities who are disenfranchised by their provincial governments because their provincial governments focus on a specific way their transportation is going to service the voters. That happens within cities. There are already people who are disenfranchised. Like, obviously, we would like to fix that problem. We would like to prevent that problem from happening. But like, look at what bus service to East St. Paul looks like. There is a reason that this is an issue, and putting it up to the federal level isn't actually going to make it a worse issue. It is going to be different. But by keeping a stake both in the provincial and the municipal, but also elevating it to the federal, as was stated in our model, is going to provide more voices, more opportunity to speak, and we think more voices likely means less people being disenfranchised. So I want to do a bit of a rebuild by talking about the refutation we heard. So from side opposition, we heard this point that like there are places where it does make sense, and that Ontario and Quebec, they should just work together if that's important to them. But that's exactly the point that we are making on side government, is it is important to the people living in those communities, but because Quebec is now controlled by literally a separatist government, they would rather have their citizens who need to make that trip make it a harder trip so that they feel more connected to Quebec, so that they don't feel like they can just go to Ontario, so that they feel like they are Quebecois and not Canadian. But you would disagree.
Mr. Speaker, why not give federal government the ability to supersede in those cases? Why do they need the ability to supersede all of intercity transit for that to happen?
The reason is because we want a unified national transit plan. The problem of moving people does not stop because there are borders. The problem of moving people does not stop because there aren't borders. You need to move people across borders and within borders. People don't suddenly walk to the border and go like, oh, I guess I'm gonna like stop walking now because this is like my domain. I don't go in this area. We want to change that idea. We don't want people to think of themselves as just Quebecois. We want them to think of themselves as Canadian. And by linking all of our transit systems, it makes transportation easier. And when people can move economically, socially, and literally, we get a more unified Canada. Once again, side opposition is leaning on the status quo to say, well, because things are the way that they should not change. This does not stand. I'd like to see the link work of why the fact that things are the way they are is good, rather than just hearing this same old tired, this is the way things are and this is the way things must be. We also heard the idea that this is already happening with private options such as Flair Air. On side opposition, they're ignoring the fact that Flair Air just like cancels flights because like it is difficult to do this without huge federal oversight. And we say on side government, if this is already happening, let's make it happen faster. If there is a need for this, if there is a demand for this, which is the only reason it would be already happening, as side opposition recognizes, we as the Canadian government have a duty to our citizens to help them, to make it serve Canadians rather than feed off of them. The purpose of public transit is not to make a profit. The purpose of public transit is to move people socially, economically, and physically across the country. Now, okay, I'm going to try and get into my point about equity. Hopefully that basis is going to make a little bit of sense because I've had to untangle a lot. So, the first thing I want to talk about is inaccessibility. As it currently stands, a lot of public transit is actually very inaccessible to people. And this is because it is designed to serve specific groups without the broader outset. It is very difficult for disabled people to use public transit. It is very difficult for people who need to visit hospitals to take the bus to the hospital because the systems are not designed for that. And I'm not saying that it is automatically going to become easier once we upgrade it to the federal level, but once we have a unified transit plan, once we have an overarching body, it becomes easier to focus on those details than to simply focus on surviving and how you're going to take as little as possible out of your provincial or municipal budget. We can piggyback on the green promises that we've made, and we can provide Canadians with a better public transit system, because a public transit system is a good, not something that Canadians should be providing government with profit off of. The purpose of public transit is to move people socially, economically, and physically. We also have the problem of the externalities are affecting us all. When workers can't get to work because of flawed public transit, that affects us all. When people cannot take a green option because there isn't a green option, then that affects us all. And these externalities are a serious problem for all Canadians. So what have we shown you today? We've shown you that federal oversight is necessary because as side opposition recognizes this is a direction that Canada should and is already moving in with their points about Ontario, with their points about Flair Airlines. Because this is already happening, we as the federal government have a duty to provide Canadians with this good, and we are best suited to it because, as side opposition says, Canada is geographically large, and for these reasons this resolution must stand. Thank you.
I think the member for the speech and called the third opposition member. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I didn't think it was possible for this debate to get any more muddled. That was until the last speaker came up and gave his speech. I want to clear something up for our side of the House that's very important to understand. We don't necessarily vote for status quo. We never said that we did. We never said that that was the most efficient way, and that's not what we're here to prove, nor what we need to prove. What we are here to show you is that their approach to public transit at a federal, at a provincial level is not the most efficient way to go about in this country. And that's what they have to prove to win this debate, and that's what they've failed to prove thus far. And even if they get even a little close in their reply speech, it's way too late. That being said, I want to jump into some refutation, and I'm going to do it in this way. I'm going to look at it thematically, under two lenses. Number one, what divides Canada and what brings Canada together? Something both sides of the House seem to care about. And second, what really creates an efficient public transit, both inside of cities and getting between them and provinces and other provinces? Our side of the House obviously does this best. And I'm going to do that by doing a point-by-point analysis. Let's first look at the division issue. You know, the first point that was brought up by the leader of the government was that national unity. Canada is very divided, and having a united federal approach to this will bring people together. First of all, everyone being on the bus system does not make people more patriotic. That's such a shot in the dark, but let's skim over that. Let's look at the second point. They're failing to identify the problem with the system. Specifically, how the smaller electoral provinces will get further disenfranchised. You know, it's funny, the amount of contradiction. Time and time again, side opposition said, each province has different approaches to how they want to deal with public transit. Nobody's going to agree on it, and that's why the federal government needs to step in and force it and mandate it. But yet they're here to say that forcing and mandating everybody under the same umbrella will make people feel more united? How is Quebec going to feel more united to the rest of Canada when they want nothing to do with this system? But yet you seem to disagree.
Honourable Speaker, side opposition continues to misunderstand. The uniting factor is not the fact that the federal government will control it. The uniting factor is the benefits and opportunities to Canadians because of a national system.
Absolutely not. You're completely ignoring what I'm saying. What I have said is that provinces don't want to deal with it the same at a national level. You're saying that you're going to step in and nationalize it and make everything the exact same way? How are they not going to feel disenfranchised from the rest of Canada? They will, okay? That being said, let's jump into this other point about how Ontario and Quebec can't work together. And you know, that's why the federal government needs to step in for the entire country. Again, we're not fighting for status quo. We have no problem considering the idea that the federal government can step in areas such as this when the provinces can't work together. Why do they need access to inner city public transit that already works very well? And if it doesn't work, it's because of the lack of funding from a federal level, but I'll get into that later. Why do they need access of everything? You talk about, for example, another topic of the Aboriginal reserves not having access. I'm just going to throw this out there. That's a federal problem, okay? Something that they haven't solved, okay? Not a provincial problem. So thank you for bringing up a point for us. Second of all, if you want to fix that, federal government, very well, we agree. You should step in and provide more funding, provide more access in extreme cases like this. We're not opposed to that. But what we are opposed to is you using that as an excuse to take control of the entire country's public transit system. That's such a gap that you cannot jump. That's going to cost so much money, it's going to make things so much slower for absolutely no benefit. We agree, once again, there's problems with the status quo. We don't think that it's a good thing. We think that the federal government should step in certain ways, but we don't think that that in itself is a reason enough for them to take control of absolutely everything. Everybody in this room has probably, and maybe they haven't, used public transit within the city. If you're a student, you get it for free. That's a good thing. It's working. That being said, you still seem to disagree, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to take you. Sorry, that was a little rude. But this point of national unity is non-existent on their side of the house. All we've heard is a bunch of punchlines, he said, she said, with no actual examples to support their side of the house. All they've come up and said is, we believe in unity, their side of the house does not believe in unity. But they haven't provided actual examples of how this is the case. And you know what, I felt bad, so I'll take it.
Has side opposition failed to mention that during Confederation, the first thing that the Canadian government did was build a railway across Canada?
Thank you. And it's working for us. Do we need to build another railway? No, it's working already. You know, I'll take you too.
Does side opposition not, or does side government not understand that we are not proposing to build new railways? Instead, we are talking about funneling communication and control and the say to one governing body.
We know that's what you're proposing. You're saying it's not a good approach. You know what? This is another example. We're getting so muddled. They don't even understand what unity and what efficient public transit is. And unfortunately, I think the audience actually does. So we don't have to focus anymore on that. This second idea of an efficient public transit system, Mr. Speaker, I think it's actually Madam Speaker. Everyone's been referring to her. Madam Speaker, we don't think that the federal government should have to stick their nose in every single area of the country. We see public transit actually working in these cities, and even if it's not, increase funding, because 99% of the time, don't quote me on that fact, the reason that these public transit systems aren't working is because there's no funding, and there's no funding coming from the federal government. So if you want to fix anything, organize your books, be able to allocate those funds properly, and do your job from a federal level. This is just another example of the federal government trying to take control over something that they have no purpose in doing. And you know what? I think it's obvious enough that side government is just grasping at an attempt to prove their point by proving assertions. And Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I apologize, I'm not sure what you identify as. We did not establish that again. It's very obvious they've lost this debate just by how unclear it's been for everyone. And for that, I proudly oppose. When I said that, I meant like, I didn't know if you were Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
I wasn't trying to, you got it.
Yeah, it's fine. I'll take whatever pronouns you want to give me. Yeah, it's actually, I call upon the opposition, the official order is that Op actually gives a rebuttal first and then Gov speaks last, so I call upon the opposition to deliver a reply speech of no longer than 4 minutes.
All protected.
Yeah, all protected.
Sorry, I'm sharing my own timer.
Oh, yeah, go for it. No problem. Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Side government really likes to talk about externalities, and they say that their plan will fix it, but they don't tell us how at all. They just say federalize things and everything will work itself out. But ladies and gentlemen, that's simply not how it works. And we can't believe that that's how it works unless they give us mechanisms of how it will actually do this. Because they haven't done so, we are so proud to say that we've won this debate. So let's get into some of the main issues. What will I be doing for you today? I'll be looking at the 2 main areas of clash that have really defined this debate. First, what is divisive and what is not? And second, what is the most efficient? So let's talk about divisiveness. We tell you that there are 13 provinces and territories. And just because there's a niche zone that has an issue on one area of the provincial border does not mean the entire country needs to change. We would encourage communication between those areas that have that specific problem. And we'd say that contrary to what they've been saying throughout this debate, the entire plan on balance is incredibly divisive. So let's talk about that. My point on disenfranchisement still stands in the round, because all that Sam did was say the province also disenfranchises people. Look at East St. Paul. Okay, but that by no means disproves our point that this won't get worse under a federal system. We'd say that that is incredibly likely to happen. Like, at least East St. Paul has an MP who can like go make a stink in provincial parliament and stuff like that. We think that that power with like 4 times the amount of people who they need to compete with airtime with makes it incredibly more difficult for an area like East St. Paul to get any kind of improvement. And that is especially worsened when East St. Paul is in a province that doesn't really contribute to a victory in a federal election. Those points still stand, and we're happy to stand behind them. But furthermore, Raph also told you about how this is divisive in many more ways. Like Raph said, no one is asking for this, and especially not Quebec. And when they talk about uniting the country, they're talking about opening doors and opening opportunities, and I thank Sam for that POI. But we've sufficiently told you that that isn't actually what's going to happen. We said that, these options already exist. And when we look at the private sector and what it's been doing, we say that that is a prime example of how change is already happening. The federal government doesn't need to step in this case. The private sector, like Flair, despite its difficulties, is responding to demand, and we are happy with what it's doing. It doesn't infringe in any political way, and we're very happy with that. All right. We also say that it's much more than that. We say that in order for them to win, they actually need to prove to us why their way is the best way. And we really haven't heard that. We've suggested to the House the possibility of having something like transfer payments, putting more money in the pockets of provincial governments so that they can go and do the things that actually matter to them. We look at the rail system or the subway system that's been trying to have been built from UBC, from like Central Vancouver to UBC. That's been in the works for like almost a decade now. And one of the main barriers is funding. We say that transfer payments is a really good way to get that project rolling without infringing on provincial rights or like messing with the balance of elections. So in conclusion, we'd say that this isn't necessary and it's incredibly divisive. If we want Canada to be united, we shouldn't federalize transportation. If we want things to continue to remain efficient, we say leave it to the markets, let Flair Air and other competitors continue to do what they are doing. And if they're going to propose anything, propose something that works with mechanisms and impacts, because they haven't done that. We are so proud to have won this case. Thank you.
And I thank you, member, for your speech, and I now call.
I need to leave. Sorry, bye.
Oh, okay. I'll send you your.
Yeah,
Bye,
text
Sam.
me.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for coming, guys. Really appreciate it.
Do you want to throw out your recycling?
What?
You want to throw out your recycling?
No?
Okay. And on that note, I call upon the government member to deliver her final rebuttal for no more than 4 minutes, and start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So today's side opposition is extremely upset that in a time limit of 7 minutes, we did not provide a complete and detailed national plan, which is ridiculous. This is why I'm going to reiterate our model and remind everybody what we believe is the result of government's proposition. We believe that provinces and municipalities would sell a 51% stake of all public transit to the federal government, including 100% say in and responsibility for infrastructure and operations. We would also implement our revenue sharing system with the municipal or provincial interest. All separate public transit firms would be unified under a federal body. I think that side opposition forgot that today in all of their refutations and points. Understanding that we believe that the federal government is the best governing body to have control over public transit, as it is not just a method of transit that affects Manitobans or people in Ontario. It is a Canadian shared identity. We all use public transit, and we all believe that our country would be greater if it was greener and more efficient to travel within. We have outlined 2 main points, both the social and the economic importance of this, and how this would move people socially, economically, and literally. To reiterate our economic goals, we would have a goal of sharing costs, understanding that there is a revenue sharing model that we very clearly outlined within the first minute of our opening speech, which was so easily forgotten by opposition. We also believe that we have the potential to influence climate change with one body focusing on our goals and our promises to deliver those. We also would like to see less cars on the road, and what better way to do that than to have one governing body operating our transit system and lowering costs, increasing accessibility, increasing efficiency, than having the federal government take control. We've also talked about the social aspects and effects of this. Understanding that with a federal transportation system, our national identity and unity goes up. Again, this is not just a Manitoban or Ontario issue. This is a Canadian problem, not just separated by province, although each province may be affected differently. We won't dispute that. However, it is a Canadian overall identity. We would also like to see increased accessibility, both in price and cost of running and using these programs, as well as seeing individuals that are disabled, marginalized, and in difficult to reach locations have higher accessibility to these services, which provide them with the essential needs that they have in their life. Side opposition has complained that we have focused on externalities. And why is that a complaint when they are so important? What happens externally affects everything that we do in our lives. It affects us all. So why not have a public transit system focused and run by the government where all of our externalities will be diminished, not because they're no longer important, but because we have a more powerful, more effective, higher financially literate and able body governing it. For this reason, the motion today must stand.
And that concludes the cross, or invite you guys, sorry, to cross the floor. Spectators, if you want to say comments, you can, but also feel free to have it. It's been a
Yeah.
long day.
Good job.
You guys can step outside.
Super comment, girl.
Well, I just wanna talk about it first.
Oh, okay, we're gonna take a few minutes
Yeah,
to
can we
chat about it.
and then we'll.
Okay.
See you in, let's say
Yeah, leave
5,
your stuff here, there's like
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Oh,
because
so I
we've
can
been
go
here
wash
for
her.
14
Perfect.
hours.
Yeah.
Trust me, I've been here since 5:45 in the morning. Like,
Just
so,
like
more than,
spill
oh my
your shit.
god, when did you vomit on yourself?
Well,
You're a disaster, George.
Yeah, when did he go from like someone
Why
put
is your
together to
men's
like?
team so much better looking?
It happened when he just popped off.
Why are you guys all ugly?